Hello everyone. This is going to be my second attempt at capturing a video of myself going through the first part of Lecture 8. Unfortunately, I have already made a video basically starting from here at language and going right on up to adolescence, but it ended up getting recorded in a very, very large file format and it's pretty much impossible to upload. So I'm going to go through these notes for the second time and hopefully I'll have better luck with uploading this time. So, last class we left off talking about language and we went through these notes, but I'll just review them very quickly. So, we talked about the fact that language is a set of rules for combining inherently meaningless elements into utterances that convey meaning. We talked about some of the other properties of language, such as the fact that it permits us to discuss displacement and things like that. But the main question we wanted to talk about was, is language innate? Is it inborn, genetic? Or is it learned? So we talked about the fact that many psychological scientists believe that there is an innate facility for language in human beings, which evolved because it was very beneficial. And of course, then we moved on to talk about Noam Chomsky and his specific theory of humans having an innate mental module known as a universal grammar. He did have quite a bit of evidence for his claims. However, there were many flaws pointed out over the past decades, so there were some pros and cons to his theory. And then we turn to, instead of talking about the innate capacity for language, to talking more about the role of experience in language development as well. So we talked a little bit about the fact that children will learn probability of specific word combinations over time, and also we talked about theorists using computers to design computer neural networks, which are mathematical models of the brain that can acquire some aspects of language. So we talked about a few different theories there. So this is where we left off. So now we're going to talk about some of the stages of language development, basically from cooing right up to full communication. So the acquisition of language may actually begin in the womb. We see babies showing a clear preference for the language spoken by their mother while in utero. So for example, they did studies where they had mothers who spoke English and then mothers who spoke English and Tagalog, and during their pregnancy and afterwards, like once the baby was born, they measured their preference for those languages, and the infants whose mothers had only spoken English showed a clear preference for English, whereas the ones who had spoken both languages showed interest in both. So there was definitely an aspect of language having been the beginning of language acquisition occurring before the child was actually born. Infants are already responsive to the pitch, intensity, and sound of language, and parents take advantage of this by using what's known as parentese. So parentese is essentially baby talk. It's higher and more varied in pitch than normal talk, and it has exaggerated intonation and emphasis on vowels. So this helps babies to learn the melody and rhythm of their native language. A study of how mothers talk to their children versus their pets showed that mothers actually only exaggerated the vowel sounds for the children, unless, of course, the pet was a parrot. And, of course, parrots are known to actually pick up some aspects of human language. So basically what it seemed to show was that the mothers were only exaggerating the vowel sounds as a method of teaching for when they were talking to the child or the pet, in the case of the parrot, that they believed would one day eventually be able to talk back to them. So by 4 to 6 months, babies can recognize their own names and other emotion-laced words such as mommy, daddy, and they know many key consonant and vowel sounds of their own languages. So over time, exposure to native languages actually reduces the ability to perceive speech sounds that do not exist in their own language. So for example, Japanese children, the la-ra distinction that we have in English does not exist in their language. So you can see Japanese infants will be able to tell the difference, the la from the ra, whereas the older children cannot. So as they age, they actually start to lose those aspects of speech that do not exist in their own language. Between 6 to 12 months, babies become increasingly familiar with the sound structure of their native language. They can distinguish words from the flow of speech, and they will listen longer to violations, so things that violate their expectations. At 7 months, they can remember words they have heard, but may not recognize them from different people. So they're starting to distinguish specific words, and every time the certain person says the word, they will be able to recognize it. However, they may not always be able to recognize it if a different person says it. However, by 10 months, they can recognize the same word from different people. So you see that leap in ability there. At 1 year, they start to name things, and they have concepts in their mind of familiar people and objects, which are often reflected by their first words. So for example, mama, doggy, dada, things like that. The things that are the most familiar to them. Symbolic gestures also begin at the end of the first year. They are actually very important and should be encouraged. Symbolic gestures can be used to refer to objects, to request something, to describe, and to reply to questions. So children whose parents encourage these gestures actually go on to acquire larger vocabularies, have better comprehension, they're better listeners, and are less frustrated in their efforts to communicate. So obviously these gestures are not a language substitute, but they are definitely related to language development. And contrary to popular belief, these brain stimulation videos, which say that, they'll teach your kid more language and things like that, they're can also often be shown to actually slow language acquisition. So, for example, in a study of 8 to 16-month children, they found that every hour a day spent watching these videos, the children actually acquire 6 to 8 fewer words than those who aren't watching the videos. So parents reading and talking with them actually cause them to learn faster than the children who are watching these videos. However, these videos are not all bad. If a parent is watching with the child or spends time using computers, these types of things are positively related to the vocabulary. So then you get between 18 months and 2 years, children begin to develop what's known as telegraphic speech. It's basically stringing words together in 2 or 3 word combinations, which omit unnecessary words but accurately convey meaning. So for example, saying want milk to mean I want some milk, or go park to mean I want to go to the park. So you can see that the meaning is clear just from these 2 or 3 word combinations, but they omit any words that are kind of unnecessary. And 2-year-olds can also use syntax to acquire new verbs. So if they're given statements such as Jane blicked the baby versus Jane blicked, regardless of the fact that they might not know what blicked is as a verb, obviously it's something that was made up, they would know if it's in that first statement, then there's two people involved, Jane and the baby, versus Jane blick would just be indicative of one person. And so they can use the syntax and kind of the word order and how things are structured in a sentence in order to help them derive the meaning of the verb itself. So children learn actually 5 to 8 new words a day between ages 2 and 6. And by the age of 6, the average child has a vocabulary of 8,000 to 14,000 words. And so they're able to absorb and infer meanings through both grammatical and social context. So there's a lot going on in those first 6 years of life in terms of language development. So now that we've talked a bit about language, we're going to move on to thinking and the development of cognition. So we have a man known as Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist who proposed that children's cognitive abilities unfold naturally. Many of his specific conclusions have been modified or rejected over the years, but his work inspired thousands of studies by researchers worldwide. So Piaget actually thought that in order to adapt to new information or experiences, a child must do one of 2 things. So if they have a new experience or they encounter new information, they must take that information and either assimilate it into their existing mental categories. So for example, a Labrador and a Terrier, a Chihuahua all fit into the category of dog. So if they encounter any one of those creatures, not knowing what they are, but they already have that category for dog, they're able to assimilate that information into the category. Or they have to accommodate their new experiences by changing their mental categories. So for example, if they are familiar with dogs and they can kind of assimilate instances of dogs into their category, if they encounter a cat, which they've never encountered before, then they need to create a new category. It doesn't fit into the pre-existing categories that they already have. So they must create a new category for it. So Piaget said that both of these processes, the assimilation and the accommodation, are constantly interacting as children go through 4 stages of cognitive development. And these stages are very important. They're very well known in terms of cognitive psychology, and particularly in child development. It's a very well-known theory. We will discuss some revisions and and modifications to these stages afterwards, but they were very important at the time. So the first stage that Piaget talked about was the sensory motor stage. So he said from birth to age 2, an infant learns through concrete actions, so, touching, grasping, things that they can put their hands on. And at this stage, their thinking consists of coordinating sensory information with bodily movements. So they will learn that specific movements produce specific results. Also very important to this stage, it's when they gain object permanence, which is the sense that something continues to exist even when you cannot see or touch it. This starts to develop around 6 months, and by a year it should be pretty much solidified. And it represents the beginning of the capacity to use mental imagery and symbols, so it's a very important stage in cognitive development. So then you have the pre-operational stage, which is from ages 2 to 7. So you have children who still lack cognitive abilities necessary to understand abstract principles of mental operations, and they're unable to take another person's point of view because their thinking is egocentric. So it centers on them and their actions, their thoughts, their beliefs. So Piaget thought that children at this age were not able to kind of see things from someone else's point of view. And he also thought that at this point they cannot grasp the concept of conservation. So conservation basically means that the physical properties of an object do not change just because its form or appearance does. And I've got a picture on the next slide here to show you a little bit about what that means. So on the left here, we have a little girl and she's looking at 2 balls of clay, one of which has been flattened out and the other that still remains in spear form. And then on the right side, you've got a kid who's looking at a tall glass of orange juice and a short glass of orange juice. So basically what Piaget said, in terms of conservation, a child would look at these two, so for example in the clay they would look at the ball and the flattened clay, and they would say that because the appearance has changed, these two must differ in some way. So they would say that the clay that's flattened, there's actually more of it because it looks bigger to them. Or on the right side they would say, well, there must be more orange juice in that tall skinny glass because it looks much higher. So they're unable to grasp the fact that despite the fact that the form and appearance changed, the physical properties didn't actually change at all. There's still the same amount of clay and the same amount of juice. So once a child develops the ability to work with conservation, then they would know that the actual physical properties did not change. But up until now, they wouldn't be able to make that distinction. So the next stage in Piaget's theory of cognitive stages would be the concrete operation stage. So at this point, the children are ages 7 to 12, and they are increasingly able to take the perspective of others. They make much fewer logical errors. Their mental abilities are tied to information that is concrete, so things that have actually happened to them or concepts that they can kind of have a tangible meaning for. But they will still make errors when they're asked to think abstractly about abstract ideas. But at this point, they do understand conservation, as well as things such as reversibility and cause and effect. So they're beginning to grasp some of those more abstract ideas, but they're still not quite there in terms of abstract processing. And then finally, you have the formal operation stage. So from around age 12 or 13 up until adulthood, you have teenagers and adults who are capable of abstract reasoning. They can reason about situations not experienced firsthand, and they're able to search systematically for the answers to problems as well as draw logical conclusions. So they're able to actually kind of do more with abstract principles and things than children at younger ages are. So overall, Piaget's central idea in terms of these stages has been well supported, in that new reasoning abilities depend on the emergence of previous ones. However, further research into the minds of even the youngest infants, because we're now able to work with younger and younger infants and kind of sense things about what they're thinking and how they're feeling, have led to modification of his theories, and at times some rejection. So now we're going to go through a few of the more current views of cognitive development, things that have kind of developed from his original theory of stages. So the first, in terms of current views of cognitive development, would be that cognitive abilities develop in continuous, overlapping waves rather than discrete steps or stages. So in terms of developing cognitively, they're saying that the learning occurs gradually, and you may sometimes retreat to former ways of thinking, but may also advance to new ones. So it's not so much discrete one step after the other, it's kind of back and forth and in kind of a continuous, gradual development. And they also found that reasoning ability depends on circumstances as well. So you may not show the same levels of cognitive development when asked questions by different people or put in different situations. So the overall point here is that cognitive development is more continuous as opposed to occurring in those discrete steps or stages. The second finding, more current finding in terms of cognitive development, is that preschoolers are not as egocentric as Piaget thought. So he said that, children could not kind of take the mind of others or see things as someone else might. But in fact, most 3 to 4-year-olds can take someone else's perspective. And they know that you cannot predict what a person will do just by observing the situation or knowing the facts. So, for example, people could be lying or could be hiding things from you. They understand that. At this point, they begin to develop what's known as a theory of mind, which is a system of beliefs about how their own mind and other people's minds work, and how people are affected by beliefs and emotions. They are using verbs like think and know, so indicating that they're thinking kind of more about their mental processes. And it's been shown that there are aspects of a theory of mind that are present in infancy. So, for example, even infants can show surprise when they learn an adult has a false belief. And in terms of theory of mind, just to give kind of an example of when that's developing, they've done studies where, they would ask a 3-year-old, they'd show a child come into a room and put a ball in a basket, and then they'd show an adult come in and move that ball, maybe to another bin on the other side of the room. When they asked 3-year-olds, when the child comes back, where is he going to look for the ball, the 3-year-olds would say where the adult put it, because that's where they know it to be, so they weren't able to kind of think of what the child was going to think. But if they asked a 4-year-old where the child was going to look for the ball when they came back, the 4-year-old would actually say that they would look in the basket where it was, because they were able to think in terms of what that other child would be thinking when they came back, not knowing that somebody had moved the ball. So it was very clear that they were able to kind of take the perspective of that other person. So the third point to be made about current views of cognitive development is that children, even infants, reveal cognitive abilities much earlier than Piaget believed. So we know now that babies may actually be born, and we've talked about this before, with mental modules or core knowledge systems for spatial relations, properties of objects, and other features of the physical world. So at only 4 months of age, babies can look longer at impossible feats. They do look longer, So, for example, if they see, a ball seem to pass through a solid barrier, or a ball that's kind of suspended in midair, they will look longer at it, indicating that they understand that this ball is not then obeying the laws of physics. And 5-month-olds can actually perceive others' actions as being intentional. So they know, for example, if they're shown a woman who kind of bumps into something and knocks it over versus someone who actively pushes it over, they can kind of tell whether that object was intentional or not, that action was intentional or not, which kind of goes against that whole egocentric notion of not being able to understand what somebody else is thinking or feeling. So the fourth, then, current view of cognitive development is that cognitive development is influenced by a child's culture, because up until now we've been more talking about those innate principles and things that happen naturally, but there was a psychologist named Lev Vygotsky who said that social cultural influences must be emphasized in children's cognitive development. He thought that children develop mental representations of the world through their culture, language, and the environment, and that adults play a major role in this process. So instead of stages, he believed that children's cognitive development may proceed in any number of directions. While some of his views, again, were extreme, just as some of Piaget's were, he was correct in that culture does shape and structure children's cognitive development. So these are just a few of the kind of more current views of cognitive development and things that have been shown to have changed over time and been modified since the time that Piaget presented his initial cognitive stages of development. But despite these modifications, Piaget left an enduring legacy. He taught us that children are not passive vessels into which education experiences are poured, and that they actively play a part in interpreting their worlds. So he did teach us much about cognitive development in children. So now we'll turn from the cognitive, the thinking and the language, into the more kind of moral development field. So we had a researcher named Lawrence Kohlberg who said that the children's ability to understand right from wrong evolves along with the rest of their cognitive abilities through 3 stages. So much like Piaget's stages of cognitive development, he had stages of moral development. So he said at first, children will obey because they fear being punished, and then later because they think it is in their best interest to obey. So when they're young children, 10 and below essentially, these are the reasons that they may do what they think is right. At around age 10 then, moral judgment becomes based on conformity and loyalty to others. And then it is, during this stage, it is later based on an understanding of the rule of the law. So in the second stage, you've got children not only they're not obeying because they fear being punished or think it's in their best interest, they're kind of more obeying due to conformity and being loyal and following the laws and the rules of society. And then finally, the third stage, it occurs in adulthood and doesn't actually affect all people, but most people seem to develop a moral standard based on universal human rights. So most people, as they grow and mature, are able to not only say what's right and wrong based on, what's in their best interest and conforming with others, they are able to develop this moral standard that's based on knowing what rights, universal rights humans should have. So while Kohlberg was right in saying that moral reasoning ability increases during the school years, unfortunately so do behaviors like cheating, lying, and cruelty, as well as the ability to rationalize these behaviors. So he did have some good ideas there, but there was still some work to be done within the field of moral development as well. So today's developmental psychologists place a greater emphasis on the emergence of conscious and moral emotions. So emotions such as shame, guilt, empathy, etc., all those emotions that are related to, kind of feeling bad and having a conscience and kind of wanting to do what's right. So now we kind of say that children do not obey rules only because they fear the consequences of disobeying, but that they do so because they also understand right from wrong. And the capacity actually for differentiating right from wrong may be inborn. So for example, by age 5, children know that it is wrong to hurt someone, even if they are asked to do so by someone who's an authority figure. So this kind of illustrates that those behaviors may have an innate tendency, you have an innate tendency towards those types of behaviors. And this type of capacity may have originated in cooperative altruistic strategies that help resolve conflicts and kind of maintain relationships. So they may have been important during evolution, which is why they kind of originated and were maintained over time. Parental techniques were also assumed to have an effect, but many behavioral genetic studies provide evidence that the effectiveness of parental techniques depends on what kind of child they have. So a lot of the time we kind of blame parents if childs act out and that kind of stuff because, they should have kind of taught them better, but it's very important to note that it's not just the environment. Sometimes children may have innate tendencies that cause them to act out no matter what how their parents have tried to raise them. So we say dandelions are kind of children with the easygoing temperament who are very easy to get along with and quite easy to raise. And then you have orchid children who are, very kind of finicky and if not treated, in exactly the right way, they can lash out and have behavior problems and that kind of thing. So there can be innate tendencies within the child that interact with the parental techniques and determine how effective they will be. So today, keeping this in mind, many researchers seek a middle ground, which we kind of strive to find through gene and environment interactions. So in terms of getting children to be good, the ways in which we're able to try and influence the behavior of our children, we see many parents trying to enforce moral standards by using what's known as power assertion. And this is basically generally taking advantage of being bigger, stronger, and more powerful. Power assertion may include threats, physical punishment, and deprivation of privileges. Other parents rely on induction, which appeals to a child's sense of empathy, helpful nature, affection for others, and sense of responsibility. So it references their own abilities rather than external reasons for being good. So, you want to be kind to someone because think about how they feel. You want to make sure you don't hurt their feelings and make them feel bad. So people who are using induction could say, well, I think you should help this person because if not, they might feel bad, or I knew you were a really good person all along, so of course you're going to help this person, right? So you're appealing to those more positive aspects of their nature. So culture and context in which the discipline occurs can make a big difference, but it's often shown that power assertion, especially when it consists of parental bullying and physical punishment, is associated with greater aggressiveness and reduced empathy, and in many cases, induction seems to be the more effective form of discipline. So out of the two, the induction seems to work the best on average. So when we talk about moral development, we also want to talk about self-control and conscience. And so self-regulation is basically the ability to suppress immediate impulses and wishes, and it is one of the most important social emotional skills that a child needs to acquire. So basically, self-regulation predicts a child's ability to delay gratification. For example, we talk about something called a marshmallow test, and basically that means that children are given a choice. They're given one marshmallow and they're said, you can eat this marshmallow right now, or you can wait a little while and you'll get 2 marshmallows instead. So basically, the child who is able to wait and hold off from eating the first marshmallow in order to get 2 is a child that is exhibiting an ability to delay gratification. And so those children who do exhibit this type of ability are much better able to control negative emotions, to pay attention to a current task, and to do well in school. In fact, being able to delay gratification actually has effects on health, success, and well-being that have been shown to last for decades. And this skill was partially influenced by temperament and personality as well, but also by learning. So we've seen longitudinal studies of 106 preschool children that showed that those most able to regulate their impulses early in life were the least likely to get in trouble later and the most likely to have a high conscience score, and that self-regulation was negatively correlated with mothers' use of power assertion. Of course, whenever we talk about correlations, it's important not to oversimplify. So for example, just because we saw a relationship between self-regulation and use of power assertion does not necessarily mean that the mother's use of power assertion caused lower self-regulation. It may be that the child was innately impulsive and aggressive and that caused the mother to use power assertion. So we can't oversimplify in cases like this, but there was a negative correlation there between those two. So we've talked a bit about moral development. Now we're going to move on to gender development. And gender development is the last section before we get into adolescence, which will be the end of this video because I've got adolescence and beyond filmed on another video for you. So we'll get through the gender development and then that'll be it for this video. So a baby's sex seems to be the first thing that everyone notices and announces. I mean, you don't ever see a baby being born and you say, oh, it's a black-haired baby, oh, it's a, blue-eyed baby. You always say, oh, it's a girl, oh, it's a boy. It's the first thing that's always announced when a child is born. But how soon do children themselves notice that there are different sexes, and when do they understand which one they are? So to talk about these types of questions, we first need to introduce some terms that are related to gender development. The first is gender identity. So gender identity is a child's sense of being male or female and belonging to a certain sex. Then we have gender typing, which is the process of socializing children into their gender roles. So it reflects society's ideas about which traits, behaviors, and interests are masculine or feminine. It's important to note that a person can have a strong gender identity but not be gender type. So for example, there can be, men who are very comfortable in their masculinity and therefore, they partake in activities such as, needlepoint or something that's considered inherently feminine, or maybe they work in a career that's typically considered feminine. And conversely, you can have women who, are employed in the field of combat and maybe they participate in activities that are considered more typically masculine. So it doesn't mean that they don't have a strong gender identity. They may just be comfortable in their gender identity and they aren't falling prey to kind of the gender typing. So in the past, researchers have tried to distinguish between sex, which was known as the anatomical attributes, so the actual physiology, and gender, which would be the learned differences or the kind of experience and the way you feel. But today these terms are often used interchangeably because, as we know, nature and nurture are inextricably linked. However, there are, of course, some people who do not fit the typical categories of male and female. So we have what's known as intersex conditions, which is formerly known as hermaphroditism. And this occurs when chromosomal or hormonal abnormalities cause a child to be born with ambiguous genitals or genitals that conflict with their chromosomes. Many of these intersex individuals will grow up and label themselves as transgender. So transgender is basically a broad term which describes people who do not fit comfortably into the usual categories of male and female. There are some who are comfortable living with the attributes of both sexes, while others feel uncomfortable in their sex of rearing and they wish to be considered a member of the opposite sex. So it's kind of a very broad category that incorporates all of these people. And then finally, you have transsexual, which is someone who is not technically intersex, so they don't technically have those chromosomal or hormonal or physical abnormalities, but they feel nonetheless that they are in the wrong body, and many of these individuals go on to transition later in life so that they can become a member of the sex which they prefer. So, now that we've talked a little bit about the terms related to gender development, we need to move on to the different types of influences that might affect gender development. So we have many interacting influences that act upon development of gender identity and gender typing, and they fit broadly into three major categories. So we have the first, which are the biological influences. We have the second, which are the cognitive influences, and we have the third, which are the learning influences. And the following slides will list some of the major findings on each type. So we'll start off with the biological influences. Children all over the world usually choose to play with friends of the same sex, and the types of play tend to differ by sex. So for example, males are more likely to go for physical roughhousing, risk-taking, and aggressive play. And there are also certain types of toys that tend to be preferred by each sex. Biological scientists believe that these play and toy preferences have a basis in prenatal hormones. So particularly the presence or absence of prenatal androgens. So the androgens or masculizing hormones that are being secreted while the embryo or the fetus is in the womb. Girls exposed to higher than average levels of prenatal androgens are later more likely to enjoy typically boy toys and are more physically aggressive. In a study of over 200 children, they found relationships between fetal testosterone levels and play styles. So higher testosterone levels, regardless of being male or female, there seem to be higher rates of male typical play later in life. And even monkeys have shown similar preferences. So, for example, they did a study with male and female rhesus monkeys, and the males tended to prefer kind of wheeled toys rather than the more cuddly, fuzzy toys, whereas the female choices, just as in human, were much more varied. Some of them preferred the cuddly, some of them preferred the wheeled. And this, of course, may have links to what we're talking about here, where dependent on these prenatal influences, you might be seeing females more or less likely to kind of attempt male typical play and playing with male typical toys. So, do these findings have anything to do with gender identity? Well, the answer to that is, of course, very complex. So we know that gender identity depends not only on the interaction of genes and prenatal hormones, but also on anatomical structures and life experiences. So, as with everything in psychology, we still have some of that nature and nurture aspect. So, it may contribute to gender identity, but is in no way the only influence on it. So, for example, they did do a study in which they had 16 genetic males who were born without penises. They were born with testes but no penis. And 2 of them, I believe, were raised as male, whereas the others were all raised as female. And later on in life, there were several of these children who were raised as female who decided that they wanted to be male and transitioned to male, whereas others stayed as females and lived their lives as females. So even within that sample, we had that same type of anatomy, but you've got varying levels of what the children felt comfortable with later on in life and how they decided to live their lives. So next we'll move on to the cognitive influences on gender development. So cognitive psychologists explain children's gender segregation and toy and play preferences by studying their changing cognitive abilities. Even before children are able to speak, infants are able to speak, they can discriminate between the 2 sexes. So even at 9 months of age, they're able to tell male from female faces. By 18 to 20 months, toddlers have a concept of gender labels. They are able to identify their own gender as well as that of others. And then shortly before age 2, they change their behavior to conform to the category that they belong to. So they kind of become more gender typed in that way. One of the most notable changes is that girls tend to stop behaving aggressively around that time. By around the age of 5, most children have developed a stable gender identity, and they understand that what boys and girls do does not necessarily indicate their sex. So up until age 5, if you're asking 3 and 4-year-olds what makes a girl, what makes a boy, you might get answers such as, well, the girls have longer eyelashes, or boys eat pizza and girls don't, or climb trees, and you've got kind of these stereotypes and misconceptions. But by the time they're 5, they understand that regardless of what children do, whether a girl likes to eat pizza or a boy likes to play with dolls, that does not necessarily indicate their sex. So they take all of the knowledge that they've got so far about gender identity and gender typing, and they consolidate it all into what's known as a gender schema. So this gender schema is a mental network of beliefs and expectations about what it means to be male or female, and what each sex is supposed to think, feel, wear, and do. But it's important to note that the content of these schemas is not innate. So based on the culture you live in and things like that, the actual content of the schema itself can change. So gender schemas seem to be most rigid around ages 5 to 7, and unfortunately some people retain inflexible schemas their entire lives. So they're very rigid in saying, girls should do this, boys should do this, they shouldn't do anything outside of their specific area. Sorry, I had a notification on my phone. Right, so unfortunately some people kind of retain this inflexibility, but many become flexible with experience and cognitive sophistication. Cultures and religions often also differ in their gender schemas. Like I said, the content of these schemas is not always innate. And unfortunately, schemas can be very powerful at times, which can cause some very negative impacts. So, for example, in our culture, we believe that both men and women have a right to an education, and it's kind of mandated that they must get some kind of an education, whereas there are certain cultures in which it's believed that females should not be allowed to receive an education. So that type of kind of gender schema can be very detrimental to people in some of those societies. So finally, we'll talk about some learning influences on gender development. Of course, we know the environment is full of subtle and sometimes not so subtle messages about what girls and boys are supposed to do. Gender socialization, which begins at birth, instills these messages in children. Something as trivial as dressing a baby in a particular color can signal adults about how to treat the child, And parents, teachers, and other adults can convey their expectation about gender without even realizing that they are doing so. So, for example, saying you're a natural versus you must have worked hard. So, depending on what trait we're talking about, for example, if it's something that's considered to be more of a male trait, and just to use this as an example, maybe someone believes that males are better at math. So, if a male performs well on a math test, a teacher might say, oh, you're such a natural, versus if a female does well on it, they would say, you must have worked really hard to get that mark. And just that subtle implication that saying, you shouldn't naturally be good at this, like if you did well, it must have been due to hard work and not natural talent, can have an impact on children without the teachers and the adults even realizing that what they're doing. So both sexes, unfortunately, tend to lose interest in activities that are supposedly not natural to them, even when they start out at first with equal abilities. And I know from personal experience, someone very close to me was a male who was an amazing figure skater, and he had so much talent, but unfortunately, due to the fact that there's that stereotype surrounding figure skating being a more female activity, and it caused him to kind of be bullied and people to constantly be telling him that it wasn't something that males should do. And despite the fact he was very talented and could have probably went very far with it, he eventually gave it up due to kind of that societal pressure. So unfortunately, even if people have talent for certain activities, if it's not something that they're supposed to be talented in, they'll a lot of the times give it up. So overall, we need to remember that gender development is a lifelong process. And over time, these schemas, attitudes, and behaviors will evolve. So just because sometimes some of these influences may be detrimental during childhood, by early adulthood, there is virtually no average difference in cognitive abilities, personality traits, self-esteem, or psychological well-being. So despite some of the issues that can occur during childhood, typically people tend to get through it and come out pretty equally competent at the end. And that is the end of the section on childhood. Now you can check the next video where I go through adolescence, adulthood, and old age.